Welcome to Cultural Mixtapes. I'm Tejas Srinivasan, and this is a show where I try to probe the minds of writers, musicians, artists, and pretty much anyone else making intriguing contributions to the cultural zeitgeist. On today's episode, we have writer Joanne Beard. She's the author of essay collection The Boys of My Youth, the novel In Zanesville, and her latest collection Festival Days was published in 2021 by Little Brown and Company. She's won several awards, including the Guggenheim Fellowship in 2005. Her essay, The Fourth State of Matter on the University of Iowa Shooting, was published in The New Yorker in 1996 and is taught in creative writing programs around the country. Beard's writing occupies a liminal space as she melds together personal essay and fiction. While reading her work after a certain point, you stop trying to figure out whether she's telling a true story or not, and simply surrender to the meditative prose. She takes you through the inner lives of several interesting characters, many of whom are herself, and her writing tugs at the rawest of human emotion as she chronicles the ordinary and extraordinary while talking about death, taking care of animals, the art of writing itself, and country life, amongst many other subjects. We sat down earlier this month to talk through her creative process, her unique approach to subjects often impossible to write about, and the abilities of writers to illuminate certain aspects of the human experience unavailable to the outside world. This conversation changed the way I approached both fiction and essay writing, and even inspired me to put some words down on the page. Before we begin, some background info. We discussed two of her essays. The first one, called Werner, is about a man named Werner Hayflick who was caught in a burning building and was able to jump and save his own life at the last minute. The other story, titled Sherry, is about a woman who was diagnosed with terminal cancer and decided to take her own life with assisted suicide. We also briefly spoke about the writer Karl Ove Knausgaard, who's known for his set of 6 autobiographical novels titled My Struggle. All the writers mentioned during the conversation are in the show notes. Hope you enjoy the show. Joanne Beard, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start with your latest book, Festival Days, which is comprised of stories that were written over the course of 20 years. So how do you go about selecting stories for a collection like this?
Well, that's a good question for anybody but me. I went about selecting them because they were all of the work that I had that hadn't been collected into a book. I just looked at all of the pieces that I had written and published, or in one case, not published over the last 20 years. And I printed them out and counted up the pages. And I had something that could be bound into a collection. So I backed into it.
Is your other collection, was it comprised in a similar manner?
Yes, the other collection, which is called The Boys of My Youth, was written mostly while I was in graduate school.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked really hard in graduate school, and I wrote a lot of pieces. And the ones that worked the most successfully, again, I just printed them out and discovered that I had almost enough pages to make a book. So I wrote a couple of extra pieces and I had a collection. Not that anybody was dying to buy it, or publish it, but I did compile a collection while I was in graduate school.
Lovely. And this book, Festival Days, is composed of personal essays, mainly personal essays, and fictional short stories. There's 2 of them in there. But you write in the introduction that the essays are also stories, and the stories are secretly essays. Beyond that, when reading through your work, I don't feel like there's a shift in tone, whether it's fiction or an essay. Are there differences in the ways you think about these 2 forms?
Well, I guess there are differences in how I think of fiction and nonfiction when I'm reading the work of other people.
Mm-hmm.
But when it's my own work, it feels like it all is drawn from the same well. So there are pieces of the nonfiction, the so-called nonfiction, that are imagined, and they're clearly imagined. The reader would not be confused about whether I imagined them or not.
Mm-hmm.
the same thing happens in the stories that are calling themselves fiction in this book. I had their exact same experiences. And then I sort of went on from there to create a more imagined, fuller, three-dimensional story.
Wonderful. Now, would you be able to hear a section of an essay in your latest book so people can get a sample of your work
Sure,
whenever you're ready?
sure. It's called Close. I have to preface this by saying that I spent my winter break trying to finish writing a book that I've been working on forever. By forever, I mean 2 years past its deadline, and at least 1 year past the point when I realized I had done thousands of hours worth of mind-breaking labor on something probably only my sister and a couple of other people would ever read. Of course, writing for my sister, actually writing my sister because she's in the book, seems to me like a worthwhile enough endeavor since I have no choice. Once I start something, I always finish, for better or worse, because it's my personality. And once you begin an essay or a story or even a lecture, as many know, it takes on a life of its own. It's like getting on a sled at the top of a hill. You're steering perhaps, but you're mostly a passenger. Writing a book, as it turns out, is the same, only very, very different, in my case at least, because over the course of 5 years or so, the snow has melted and there's just grass and gravel. It takes a lot to get the sled moving, and then it goes only a few inches. So that was my winter break, sitting on a sled every morning for hours and then trying to capture my ducks in the afternoon. I have 8 ducks. These are technically domesticated ducks, but domesticated doesn't mean they like you. In fact, just the opposite. They're called domestic ducks because people eat them and they know it. All summer, they were their own ducks, swimming on the pond and eating grubs from the bank. They can't fly, having been engineered as meat factories. So when winter comes, they need to be moved to a safe enclosure. But I couldn't catch them, even after the pond began to freeze, getting smaller and smaller until all that remained was the bathtub-sized hole we were keeping open with a heavy pipe and our own arms. The predators began to arrive like suitors every night: coyotes, bobcats, foxes, raccoons, tracks circling the pond, getting closer and closer, until one afternoon, as I stood there, a weasel came running across the ice and attacked them right in their bathtub.
Thank you so much. So, I guess, where did you think of the metaphor? How did that metaphor come to you between writing and ducks?
Well, I don't think it came to me really. I think I resurrected it, okay? Or maybe not resurrected it. I forced myself to find a metaphor. So I was writing a lecture to be given after Christmas break on the craft of writing an essay. And I couldn't make myself do it, and I couldn't focus, of course. And then one day, I just decided that I would write about trying to write. And while I was doing that, I was also messing around with my ducks and trying to figure out how to save their lives. We don't have ducks anymore, but we had them for many, many years, and they were all consuming for me. And so every day, no matter what I was doing, I was also worrying about my ducks and trying to somehow create a world in which the ducks would be happier than I was. So that's how I spent my Christmas break. And I just decided I would try writing my craft lecture about caring for ducks. Now, that actually is really a lofty goal, but I made myself focus on it to the point where I think that I've found a way to meld the two things: the craft of writing and the art of caring for ducks who don't want to be cared for.
And In your general writing process, whether it was this essay or any of your other essays, what does that look like? And what does the revision process look like, just generally?
It looks like a person fretting a lot and not being able to do it and feeling bad about it. What am I going to do about that? I'm sorry.
No, I'm sure lots of artists will resonate with that.
Yeah, so I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. And then I just forced myself to immerse completely, like to sit down and think about. I'm very familiar with what it feels like to be frustrated in my writing process, but what does it feel like to be an actual duck? And it felt like a vacation from being myself. So it actually ended up being a really fun process.
It's interesting that you call it a vacation from being yourself because the finished product is just filled with a bunch of personal reflection, and that the same goes for pretty much most of your work here. There are a few essays in the book, however, where you're telling other people's stories, particularly Werner and Sherry, and you say that you spoke to these people and or the relatives before talking about them, and you also imagine their inner lives in the story. How do you reconcile the actual events with imagination when you're piecing them together?
Well, I don't worry about reconciling it. So, what I do while I'm writing is I try to immerse myself completely in whatever scene or whatever story I'm trying to write. And I don't put any limits or parameters on that. And then when I get done, I take a look at it and I see whether I truly believe that it's nonfiction, whether I truly believe it's fiction, or whether I want to just refrain from calling it anything because it's in the gray area. So the truth is, I have so much trouble putting it down on the page correctly that I just have very little time left over to think that much about genre.
I don't want to trivialize the matter of genre, but when you go so seamlessly between fiction and nonfiction, and it sounds like you don't really pay much attention to what it is, I guess the question is when you're telling these stories, does truth or reality really matter, or does they have the same effect regardless?
Well, it might have the same effect regardless. But if I'm writing a story about someone else, like Werner Hayflick, the guy in the fire, or Sherry Trumbull, or God forbid, my ex-husband or my sister, or somebody who really matters to me in terms of how I want to portray their story, um, I do think long and hard about how they might feel about being folded into a story that essentially is illuminating something about my psyche. It usually requires that I have to ask them about that because I don't want my writing to hurt the people that I'm writing about. Sometimes people are patient and they aren't invested in it. And so they say, yeah, okay, it's clear that that they don't really see themselves in there in the way that I see them. But then there are people who do care. It makes them feel uncomfortable to see themselves through somebody else's eyes, to see truly a sliver of themselves. They know that they're a whole three-dimensional human being, and they're being portrayed in some narrow way for my purposes. It doesn't always feel good. And sometimes people say no.
Specifically in this book, can you say a little bit about how Werner and Sherry, what their thoughts were? Obviously, they
Right,
let you publish the piece, but what their thoughts were about the piece
right,
itself at the end?
right. Well, Sherry was dead. I never met Sherry. So I had to depend on her family.
Mm-hmm.
And they read it and they didn't really feel that they saw her in that character. And because she was so particular to them and such a vivid human being. But, they liked that she was not forgotten. which is an enormous thing when you lose somebody you love and they just disappear like vapor and everything that was them is gone except some pictures. And so I think that they felt like, yes, you could never capture her, but what you captured is the idea of her. They signed off on it. Werner was a different story. Werner didn't really like his.
Oh.
You know, he just felt at first that it wasn't very good writing. And I knew that that was his way of trying to, you know, because he's not a writer, he's a painter.
Mm-hmm.
He's very articulate. But I thought that that was his way of saying something just didn't breathe in it for him. So understandable, right? Because this is
Yeah.
his story. And so I said, okay, I won't publish it. But I don't want you to worry about whether it works as a piece of writing or not. And you can trust me, I would never publish anything that didn't work as writing. And I've done plenty of writing that doesn't work as writing. And he waited about 6 months and I asked him to read it again. And when he read it the second time, he said, yeah, it's okay, you can publish it. I don't think he loved it, and I don't think it felt like the memories that he had of that poignant, vivid event. But he still said yes. So it was okay. But I was prepared all the way through not to be able to publish it. I wasn't happy about it per se, but I wasn't deeply unhappy about it because I just thought, well, I learned something. I learned that I didn't get at the kernel of what it was about that story that changed Werner's life forever. If I had gotten at it, he would have said yes immediately.
It's interesting that you mention it that way because you also said before that you're trying to, regardless of whose story it is, you're still trying to examine a portion of your own psyche in the writing. When you set out to write Werner or Sherry's story, do you have a specific purpose other than obviously to tell their story, or is there something else that drives you towards particular stories like this?
No, there's something else, and it's a curiosity, I think, about human beings and how they live their lives. The Sherry story is about a woman who was not that old. She was in her early 40s and she got cancer. And
Uh-huh.
it was terminal cancer, and Jack Kevorkian helped her take her
Mm-hmm.
own life when she was in dire straits. And I just became interested in what it feels like to go all the way to your own death and then experience it. Like you can imagine that at the last moment, you might say, no, I've changed my mind, but she didn't. And I wanted to experience it for myself, what it felt like to go all the way through to the end and then step over into the beyond. And then a few years later, I heard Werner's story, and Werner's story is one in which he didn't die, but he came all the way to the end. And then he got saved, or he saved himself. And so that felt like a fascinating thing to me, like to round out my own personal knowledge. Here's a person who goes ahead and takes her own life against her wishes, but takes her own life. And then here's a guy who gets to have his life saved. I just wanted to feel what it felt like. And if you fully imagine your way into what you're writing for as many months and years as I was working on those pieces, I feel now like I experienced that for myself, even though I didn't.
Beautiful way to think about it. On those lines, I want to talk about death. It's at the center of lots of your work, and not just people, a multitude of different types of animals die throughout. And the way you handle death seems to be different from many writers in that it's often matter of fact or obvious from the start that someone or something is going to die. But the thought process, or in some cases, the actual events that the fact of death triggers, are more devastating and reflective than the deaths itself. This is a very loose question, but do you have different ways to characterize or think about death when you're making art about it?
Well, I'm not sure, but what I am sure of is that since I was a small child, I've always thought about death,
Mm-hmm.
always.
Uh huh.
I can remember You know, my mother, when I was a very little girl and sitting next to her, and I had one of those like terrible blank stares that you can see in most of the childhood photos of me under age 5. I have like this 1,000-yard stare of like a World War I serviceman in a trench. And I can remember my mother saying to me, "Does JoJo just feel sad all the time?" And I said, "No, I don't feel sad all the time, but I feel sad right now." And I really was feeling sad in that moment, which I remember, because I was thinking about how even if we lived forever, it would be a horrible, horrible thing. Like the existential dread of living forever is only slightly worse than the existential dread of not getting to live forever. And even as a little kid, and I was not a particularly smart little kid, I was not philosophical, I was not that bright, but there was something about those kind of existential questions that set me apart from all the people in my family and, you know, maybe a lot of my friends. Although when you grow up, you find the right friends, you know.
Do you think that this worrying about the existential dread of living forever and dying and similar issues, do you think that led into you becoming a writer and artist?
It probably did because it's through art that you illustrate the conundrum of what it means to be alive and be happy and also know that death is going to follow. So I began as a visual artist and I couldn't find a way as a visual artist. I wasn't very good at it, first of all, and I couldn't focus very well, as always. But I couldn't find a way to get at the stuff that I was really interested in. And once I discovered writing, and I learned to write by being an avid reader. So I jumped into writing already knowing how to write, to tell you the truth. And suddenly I thought, oh, this is it. This is how you explain the horror of being alive and the opposite of being alive. You know, I don't know what the opposite of horror is. It's not joy in my case. I'm like in my late 60s now, and now that I have a little more time on my hands, I've become sort of spiritual, although I'm gotta tell you, I'm not woo-woo and I am not religious. I'm so far from religious, but I'm a little bit spiritual. Like, why are we here? What's the world all about? How can I get out of here without wounding or making the situation any worse than it already is for people and for the planet, and especially for animals? I mean, forget people, but for animals.
Yeah, that seems to be doing this project seems to be the question at the forefront of most artists these days. And I don't think we can get away from that. It's just part of the deal. Now, I want to switch to more craft based things, I guess. And I'm particularly thinking about the essays Festival Days, as well as your famous New Yorker essay, The Fourth State of Matter. What is your process of remembering specific events from your life when you sit down to write them?
Well, the process is very painstaking. It involves sitting in a chair with a computer on my lap and thinking,
Mhm.
like thinking, remembering. And it doesn't mean that you're remembering specific moments or pieces of dialogue, but you're remembering what things felt like and what they looked like. And you're remembering who people were and how they sounded.
And in this process of recollection, do you factor in the struggle of remembering specific memories as part of your writing, like perhaps Annie or No or Knausgaard or someone like that? Or is a concrete memory the starting point of any piece?
It's memory. I'm not going to say it's concrete. Um, and it's always in service to something. Everything in, because I write essays, and essays are necessarily shorter than a novel. So I'm not going to compare what Knausgaard does to what I try to do. But what he does is, I mean, I really don't get it, but I don't have the patience for it. But I can say that in in my work, because I'm writing short, that means it's got to be intense, which means that every sentence that you write has to be doing 2 or 3 things at once. It has to tell you the story on the surface. It has to propel the plot of the piece forward. It also has to tell you something and pluck at the strings of usually agony that are under the story on the surface. So every sentence has to be doing several things at once, even if it's only through a tiny image or a little quirk of language or a repetition of language. It has to be reminding you of how the story is moving forward, and it has to be reminding you that there's a subterranean tunnel that's happening underneath you, and things are going on in that tunnel, and you have to keep feeling them and bringing them to the surface. And you can't get around it. And in Nausgaard's books, they have a lot to recommend them, but they are very quotidian, and my work isn't like that.
Yeah.
If you take a sentence out, the whole piece could conceivably fall apart. That's what I aim for.
Lovely. You mentioned that the essay has obviously different goals than a novel simply because of sheer size, and it continues to take numerous forms from news and data based stories, such as some of Gia Tolentino's writing, not all of it, to poetic renderings like Anne Carson's The Glass Essay is one of my favorites. What are the possibilities that the essay form holds, and perhaps what are some limitations?
Well, there are limitations. I'm not sure what they are. I'll see if they occur to me. Well, but I feel them sometimes. You feel these invisible walls around you that you need to take seriously. But for me, the essay, when I read one, I don't know if I achieve this in my writing, but when I read a good essay, what I'm looking for is a feeling of discovery. So frequently when you read a novel, I think there is a sense of discovery, but mostly a novelist has to block out a plot. Otherwise, it could just be like Nausgaard. It could just go on forever and make people feel crazy. But if you're writing an essay, you mostly are looking to illuminate an idea. So all you have to do is kind of go, that's the idea that I'm following. And then you begin anywhere. And as you follow that idea, you're going down a path and you're looking for more knowledge, and you accumulate until you make a discovery for yourself. It's no different than doing a math problem, except it is, but it's the same process. And so if you end with a feeling of discovery, then the reader will too. And that's a true collaboration between reader and writer. And there's no more exciting reading experience than when you feel like you're on this wild intellectual ride in the back seat of some great writer's, Maserati.
Of course, it's an Italian car that writers drive because
Would have to be.
it has to be.
Because we're rich, by the way.
I want to end on a larger question. In other interviews, you've talked about how the internet isn't necessarily a good thing for writers, even though it's certainly not going away. First of all, why do you say that? And what can writers do in the world of the internet to stay relevant and stay effective?
Well, the reason that I say that is because it's true. It fractures it deliberately in a planned out way, fractures our attention span in order to sell us products. That's it, bottom line. It's not to illuminate anything, it's to sell us products. And nobody's out there doing it for free. Everybody is selling us products. And so the deliberate effort to fracture our attention span has had a horrible effect on writing, mainly because it's had a horrible effect on reading. And there's a hugely different experience between picking up a book. I was talking about this last night with some people at dinner, and they were talking about reading on their Kindles, and they were saying, I can't remember what book I'm reading. And each time I turn the Kindle on, I have to go back and look at the cover and at the name of the author. There's a reason for that. It's because we're trained to form a relationship with the object, with the cover, with the picture of the author on the back, with the comfort of seeing the face of the book. When we look on the arm of our sofa or on our nightstand or on our kitchen table, it's like you're seeing the face of an old friend. So when you sit down and open that book, it becomes a conversation with an old friend, even though it's somebody you don't even know. And we don't have that now. We scroll through images, and images sometimes are text. Those scrolling through text moments, we're looking at images, we're not looking at words. And it's changing our brain chemistry. And it's not working out well for people. I mean, do you feel like you have as much focus as a reader now?
Not at all. I mean, I'm rereading Paula Fox's Desperate Characters right now, but I had to do it on an iPad and not in the book, and it's just a different world. There you go.
Well, if you read Paula Fox's book in the book form, it's got that great cover. I mean, it depends on which edition it is, but my cover had a little rip in the jacket, and I can see it perfectly, and you feel the age of it.
Yeah.
And you see the face of the woman that wrote it, and you keep paging back and going, wow, that's what she looked like when she was writing about this stuff. She might even have been smoking on her in her author photo, you know? It changes how you see it in time and place. She requires you in that hardcover book to come to her and live in her world. When you put her on your iPad, she has to come to your world, and it's different.
Yeah. And last question, what have you been reading? I'm not sure the watching or listening to will be much here, but what have you been reading, watching, or listening to lately that you've been excited about?
I watch and listen to things all the time. Like everything I'm saying right now is also with the understanding that I have become addicted to all the devices
As we
too.
all.
It's really terrible. I mean, I give lip service to how it's such a bad thing, but I'm weak. So I listen to things every single night, and I don't apologize for this. I listen to Terry Gross because she interviews cultural figures and
Yeah.
artists. I listen to her when I'm driving my dogs around for their evening little snort of country air. Um, I watch things on TV. I also listen to audiobooks. And I just listened to this book called An Immense World, which I absolutely love. That's a kind of a science book about animals and wildlife. And I can't remember what I'm reading, what novel I'm reading for fun. See, I can't remember. Isn't this
Right.
bad? If I was actually reading the hardcover of the book, I would know what I was reading, but I won't know till I go up and get in my bathtub and turn my Kindle on.
I believe that is it. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
And that's our show. Special thanks to Joanne Beard for joining me on this episode. To learn more about her work and see her recommendations, visit the show notes. Cultural Mixtapes is written and produced by me, Tejas Srinivasan. The music you heard on today's episode was Beethoven's Sonata number 26 and Chopin's Sonata number 2, recorded by me. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, review, and share on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen. Thank you very much for listening.